Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind, turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Reynos. Think back over the last 5 years. A pandemic, an energy crisis, supply chain chaos, trade tensions, geopolitical fragmentation, new shock, each new pressure, countries across Europe and Central Asia had to move fast. Among the instruments governments reached for was industrial policy. Since 2009, the region has logged more than 2,600 industrial policy announcements, more than one new policy every single day for 16 years. So, the World Bank's Spring 2026 Europe and Central Asia Economic Update asks the question, are any of them actually working? The answer, backed by 2 decades of data, is that the ambition is real, the spending is real, but in most of the region, the results are not matching either. In this episode, we unpack why.
That's a perfect starting point. The report takes stock of where the region stands economically. Slower growth, sticky inflation, rising fiscal pressures. And then zooms out to ask a bigger question. Can industrial policy actually help countries in the region grow in a sustainable, lasting way? That's really the heart of it.
I'm really looking forward to getting into the solutions. But to understand the policies, we first need to look at the pressure these countries are under right now. The report highlights a pretty noticeable slowdown in regional growth.
That's right. In 2025, gross domestic product growth in Europe and Central Asia dropped to an estimated 2.6%, down from 4% in 2024. The overall regional slowdown largely reflects a much slower growth in Russia.
Ah, that connects the dots for me. The data notes growth in Russia slowed to 1% in 2025 due to weaker fiscal stimulus, restrictive monetary policy, and labor shortages. But the numbers show a really interesting contrast when you look elsewhere.
Exactly. If you exclude Russia, regional growth actually firmed up to 3.6% in 2025. Central Asia even hit a 14-year high expansion rate of 7%, which is incredibly strong.
That's definitely a bright spot. However, the good news on inflation hasn't fully materialized yet. The disinflation process seems to have stalled. The report mentions median inflation was stuck around 4.8% year-on-year as of February 2026.
Yes, and current inflation remains over 2 percentage points higher than the 2.7% average we saw back in 2018 and 2019. Food price increases are the major driver here, picking up to 6.5% by February 2026. That sustained cost of living pressure really squeezes everyday families trying to make ends meet.
And it isn't just households feeling the pinch. The report points out that fiscal vulnerabilities are widening, with average fiscal deficits, excluding Ukraine, growing to 2.5% of gross domestic product in 2025.
Correct. Most countries plan limited fiscal adjustment this year, and that average budget deficit is expected to rise again to 2.7%. Government debt levels are projected to increase further to approximately 40% of GDP on average. In fact, debt in Central Europe over the past 3 years grew at some of the fastest rates in the entire European Union.
That's a heavy burden, especially with high borrowing costs and external risks looming. The conflict in the Middle East poses a substantial downside risk, as disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz could lead to a sustained jump in energy costs, tempering consumption and growth.
The data indicates that just a 10% increase in oil prices could boost average inflation by 0.3 percentage points. A prolonged period of high global oil and natural gas prices would also tighten fiscal and current account pressures significantly for energy importing nations.
Here's where this gets interesting, though. To boost growth, create jobs, and strengthen resilience to shocks, some governments have turned to industrial policies. Since 2009, countries in this region have announced over 2,600 industrial policies.
It's a staggering amount of intervention, and more than a third of the policies enacted since 2020 remain in force today. Russia and Turkey are the most active users, accounting for 44% and 30% of all regional interventions respectively.
Here's the part that really surprised me. Most people assume industrial policy is all about cutting-edge technology, but the data shows a completely different reality for this region. Nearly 2/3 of all industrial policy announcements relate to sectors like agriculture and food production.
It's a massive contrast to high-income countries outside the region, which focus heavily on high-tech and skill-intensive sectors. In Europe and Central Asia, only 10% of policies target high-tech or capital goods.
I also noticed a huge reliance on domestic subsidies rather than trade tariffs. Since 2019, subsidies in the region have surged dramatically. So much so that ECA now has the highest subsidy levels among all developing regions, despite having historically been among the lowest in the world just a decade ago.
Yes, and that's largely driven by direct funding and tax exemptions. To put that in perspective, the increase in subsidies in Kazakhstan since 2019 is about 9.5% of GDP.
Meanwhile, compared to other countries, tariffs are used less intensively. The region's average tariff rate is about 5%, which is the lowest among developing regions and similar to the global average for high-income countries.
That openness to trade is a real strength. Economic history is littered with expensive industrial policy failures, from import substitution in Latin America to the collapse of central planning in Eastern Europe. And the damage isn't always contained. When these policies go wrong, they can crowd out the very innovation and private sector dynamism they were meant to encourage.
Right. Efforts by resource-rich countries in the region to diversify using industrial policy have largely been unsuccessful. Over the last 2 decades, most have actually become more specialized in natural resources.
The outline identifies 3 primary factors for these failures. First is political capture and rent-seeking by well-connected interest groups. Second involves information asymmetries, where government officials simply lack real-time market knowledge.
And the third is flawed benchmarking. When policymakers try to replicate the success of post-war Japan or 1970s Singapore but draw the wrong lessons, focusing on state direction while overlooking what actually drove those miracles: high saving rates, strong education systems, and exceptional labor productivity.
Exactly. Across the region, there is a risk that state resources end up concentrated in large, established firms, often in traditional sectors like agriculture, leaving smaller, more innovative businesses credit-constrained and unable to compete on equal footing. That's what happens when policies entrench existing big players instead of fostering new and innovative, dynamic private sector firms.
The report is clear on this. Industrial policy works best when it is added alongside deeper structural reforms, not instead of them.
And this is the part I find most compelling. For industrial policies to actually work, they must operate within an environment of open trade and competitive markets. That's a crucial guardrail. And when deployed to address specific market failures, the preferred approach should be broad-based public investments. Things like industrial parks, better infrastructure, skill support, and export promotion, rather than handpicking specific firms to support.
So, in practice, the idea is to build a shared foundation that benefits all firms, not just the well-connected ones. When governments invest in industrial parks, train workers for priority sectors, or help domestic firms navigate foreign markets, they create conditions where competition can thrive.
Precisely. Of course, to keep all of this accountable, industrial policies need to be fully transparent. They need to be included in government budgets to allow for public oversight and evaluation against measurable economic outcomes.
Yes, and they also need built-in expiry dates, sunset clauses, with the option to renew the policy if there is evidence of success. The plan always outlines a straightforward timeline, but government programs have a funny habit of becoming permanent if you don't strictly mandate an end date.
So, stepping back, the region is navigating real headwinds. Growth is slowing, inflation remains stubborn, and geopolitical uncertainty isn't going anywhere soon. Against that backdrop, reaching for industrial policy is understandable, and it is not inherently wrong. The evidence from this region makes it clear that industrial policy is not a shortcut around the hard work of structural reforms. If foundation is strong, the business environment, the education systems, the competitive markets, and industrial policy becomes a powerful complement. Skip those reforms, and even the best designed intervention will struggle to deliver.
And if this conversation sparked your interest, we invite you to continue exploring the topic with us. You can check out another episode in our series, episode 29, From Bananas and Pineapples to iPhones, a new framework for industrial policy, where we take a step back and look at how industrial policy has evolved globally and what that means for development today. Over to you, Renos.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website. Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.